from the Daily Gazette here in Schenectady. We're at the Schenectady County Historical Society today talking with Neil Yetwin, a Schenectady High School history teacher and local historian who has done dozens of articles on various subjects that tied to Schenectady's history. We're going to start off today by talking a little bit about Mordecai Myers. Neil, when did he first pop up on your radar?
When we first moved to Schenectady about 30 years ago, someone mentioned to me that there was a Jewish mayor of Schenectady, which seemed interesting but not that unusual for the time. And when I started to do research on him, it came to light that he lived a very long and varied life before he even arrived in Schenectady. He lived to be almost 96 years old. So his time here in Schenectady as mayor was just part of a very long career.
And when did he live and when was he mayor?
He was born in 1776 in Newport, Rhode Island, and the family moved about quite a bit. He arrives in Schenectady in 1848 after the death of his wife. The family had been living in Kinderhook, where one of his daughters had married the nephew of Martin Van Buren. And he arrived in Schenectady, a very high-ranking Freemason, and had already served in the state legislature, and some of the local political movers and shakers got him to run for mayor of Schenectady. So he served two one-year terms, one in 1851, another in 1854.
Was that an issue when he ran for mayor, his being Jewish?
It didn't seem to be. His obituary mentions that his religion was different from most of those around him, but it didn't seem to be a hindrance of any kind. I've always suspected that there were probably many people who may have mistaken him for either being Dutch or German. It's not something he advertised, but it doesn't seem to be anything he was particularly ashamed of either. So,
as you began your research and you're getting to know him more and more, closer and closer, was there something that you really liked about him? Many times when you start researching somebody, you get into it and you come across something, well, kind of discouraging, and you don't even want to bother continuing your research. Did you have any obstacles like that with Mordecai Myers?
No, I think the thing that initially intrigued me was his great age at the time of his death, at a time when most people may have looked up to about half that. And when I started to look at all the things he had done throughout his life and career, it almost seemed that there were two or three different Mordecai Myers. And I come to find out that he had accomplished or been involved in this tremendous variety of events, people that he knew, prominent people that he knew, and families that his children eventually married into who were also very prominent.
Are there descendants in the area?
There are descendants. There are direct descendants of Myers in Kinderhook and as far away as South Dakota. He had 9 children. He outlived 6 of them, so there were 4 remaining. And one of his sons, whose full name, although he was called Sidney, Algernon Sidney Myers, was married to a young woman, and their daughter married Robert Lowell the first, who was a professor at Union College. Their grandchild was Robert Lowell, the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. So Robert Lowell himself in the 1960s was a direct descendant of Mordecai Myers.
Now, he was mayor of Schenectady when again?
In 1851 and again in 1854.
And was he popular? Did he run again and lose? How did that work out?
He seems to have been a very strong-willed individual who would do what he thought was right. And in fact, in 1854, when Schenectady began its public school system, he was opposed to it, the very system that I worked for. He was opposed to it because he said it would prove to be an irrevocable tax burden upon the citizens of Schenectady for all eternity.
Man, well ahead of his time.
And he resigned over it. He was only halfway through his one-year term and
he resigned
over
as
that.
mayor.
And, Casper Hoag took his place for the remainder of that tenure.
Was his political career finished by that point, or?
Not completely. When he was 84 in 1860, he ran for the U.S. Congress and lost. He was a lifelong Democrat, and in fact, the local newspapers interviewed him, and I think at one point it was believed that he was one of the oldest voters in New York State. He had been voting regularly for 75 years. He was a Jeffersonian, And I had contact with many of the people in New York City and in that area who rallied to put Jefferson in office.
How old was he when he died?
Just about 96.
96.
Yeah,
And
he died in
the year
1870.
would have been when?
He died 1871.
1871. Okay. Are his sons, any of his descendants other than Mr. Lowell, are they famous for anything? Did they distinguish themselves?
No, he was related either by blood or marriage to the Walworths of Saratoga, to the Lowells, who were initially, or most of them were in the Boston area. He married into, after the War of 1812, during which time he was severely injured, he married Charlotte Bailey, whose parents and grandparents were among the founders of Plattsburgh, from the Platt family in that area.
Mm-hmm.
So he did have familial contacts, but as his life continued, he did become a high-ranking Freemason. He was a war hero, at least in the state of New York. He was injured in the Battle of Chrysler's Field and lost the use of his left arm.
War of 1812?
War of 1812. So in November of 1813, he was shot in the left arm, leading 86 men into battle right on the St. Lawrence, and almost died. It took him about 4 months to recover, and during his recovery, he met and married Charlotte Bailey. He was 39 years old and she was 17.
Now, he married more than once?
No, he was married once.
His wife died early and then he didn't marry again?
His wife died in 1848, and at that point he moved from Kinderhook, where the family had lived for about 12 years, to Schenectady.
Do we know where his house was?
We do. The house is no longer standing, but the first place that he lived was at the Gibbons Hotel, which was downtown, and then he bought property on the site where SAC TV is right now, right at that corner, where Goldstocks was at one time.
Mm-hmm.
And then he moved from that house to the house that is back from the street. It's right, it's down a little ways from the Van Dyke.
Okay.
It's a white brick structure. It's back
Now,
from the street.
You are working on a biography of his life.
I am.
How long will it be? Do you have images to go along with it?
There are a number of photographs of portraits of Mordecai Myers. There was in existence at one time a photograph of him when he was 80 years old, but it was destroyed in a fire in Kinderhook. One of the descendants, and there were other family papers also. But there was still enough around. There are letters that are still in existence. His captain's commission from the War of 1812 is still in existence, and I have photographs of those. And there's a portrait of him when he was 21 that was made in New York City also. And
Do you know who it was painted by?
Yes, Elkanah Tisdale, who did miniatures, portraits. The original is lost. They don't know where the original is, but there is a photograph of it in a privately printed history of the family.
And would the Masons have typically and willingly and gladly accepted a Jewish person?
Yeah, not so much in Europe, but here in the United States, they were very open to people of all religious denominations, and Myers rose to 32nd degree. And from 1853 to 56, he was the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of the State of New York. So he was the top Mason for those years.
Do we know if he changed his mind about public education at all?
Not that I know of. He wanted it, as far as I can tell, he wanted it to be strictly private education. His children, and I think the children of much of that kind of upper middle class, wanted their children to have private education. Although he seems to have been very much for the rights of the average person.
Do we know how he felt about slavery?
He was opposed to slavery very early on. He was a member of the Manumission Society in New York City when he spent some years living there. He did have an ex-slave that he had freed. We only know his name is Williams. Williams was with him during the War of 1812, and it was Williams who actually carried him off the battlefield when he lost consciousness from his wound.
And did he stay with him for a long time after that, or we don't know?
We don't know. History doesn't follow Williams. He disappears after the War of 1812.
So he was a Democrat, but can we use the word abolitionist, or is that too strong?
Probably too strong. I think he was opposed to slavery, I think just on ethical and moral grounds.
Let's get a little background information on you. Where were you born?
Springfield, Massachusetts.
And how did you end up in Schenectady?
Proposition 2.5, Proposition 2.5. My wife and I both lost our jobs, and we moved from Massachusetts and got a job. I got a job here in Schenectady at the high school.
Were you always interested in history?
Always.
Any particular phase of history? The Revolution, Civil War?
All of it. All of it.
When did you start digging into local history, Schenectady's history in particular?
Well, when we first moved here, I wanted to kind of know the lay of the land, and there's history of Schenectady. Actually, my first image of Schenectady was well before we moved here. We took a family trip in 1960 from Springfield to Niagara Falls, and we passed through Schenectady.
You're a young man at this point.
Yes.
Okay.
And yeah, I was about 8 years old, and I think like a lot of our people in our parents' generation, we were told go to the library and look up the places that we're going to be passing through. And I got out some type of junior encyclopedia, looked up Schenectady, and the image of Samuel Sexton's Schenectady Massacre
Really?
came up. So the very portrait that's here, the original, was my first image of Schenectady. And I have to admit that when we were coming through town, I was disappointed that I didn't see the settlers and the Native Americans standing around on street corners. So it looked like a smaller version of downtown Springfield. That was something of a disappointment.
I can't let you go without bringing up Moses Viney. Tell us a little bit about him and when did he first pop up on your radar?
When I was just doing some general reading about the local history in Schenectady, it happened to coincide with my teaching a half-year course on African American history at the high school. And I wanted the course to be something more than just textbook history. And so I made some inquiries at Vale Cemetery, and it turns out that there is a plot of Vale Cemetery where there are interred about 80 or 85 African Americans. And one of those was Moses Viney. And in several of Larry Hart's books, there are mentions of Moses Viney, and I used that as a foundation to continue to pursue the paper trail and found out quite a bit more about him. He was born in a plantation, 1817. He escaped in 1840, made his way to Schenectady, and worked for Dr. Eliphalet Knott, who was president of Union College, and remained here until his death at the age of 92.
He was a very recognizable citizen in Schenectady during the second half of the 19th century. People would have known who he was.
Yeah, everybody seems to have known Moses Viney. He spoke to reporters all the time. There are interviews with him in the Union College newspapers of the time. He ran a livery service, so anybody who came to town, he was there to drive them around. And there are 3 existing photographs of Moses Viney, including one where he's sitting in a chair, I believe, reading the Schenectady Gazette.
The Daily Gazette,
Yes.
And that brings me to the portrait painted by Simi Knox, I think, that was unveiled at the Underground Railroad Conference History Seminar last year. When you first saw that painting, it must have had some kind of effect on you.
It had a tremendous effect on me. If anyone had told me 17 years ago that there would have been that much attention paid to Moses Viney, and to have James McPherson, Pulitzer Prize winner, talk about Moses Viney on Founders Day, I would have, it was almost like being Forrest Gump, for a couple of hours. But I think the portrait really captures Moses Viney's spirit, his courage, and it took a great deal of courage for him to make that escape and make his way up here on the Underground Railroad. So that was very, very exciting and unexpectedly so.
How do you make history interesting and exciting for high school kids?
Well, particularly even if we're discussing global history or European history, there's always a way to tie it in with local history and local sites, whether it's Vale Cemetery or the Erie Canal or immigration, and how many of the Irish immigrants, German immigrants came to Schenectady, worked here, and people from all different groups. The African American community had been here since probably before the massacre. A number of them were taken prisoner during the Schenectady massacre. So you can tie it in with different groups, I think.
And that seems to get them interested a little bit anyway?
Yeah, there was an historian years ago who said that all history really is local history. It picked the most monumental battlefields or whatever it may be, and someone lived nearby. It was someone's neighborhood. And I think if you present it that way, it makes it more alive.
Neil Yetwin, thank you for spending some time with us today.
Thank you.